Alright, so what I'm going to be showing you guys today is essentially all the different tools that you can use in Lightroom. So once you've imported your photo and you go to your Develop tab, this is what you're going to see. So if you shot in RAW, you're going to have a bunch of different profiles here. They're all going to interpret your photo differently. So for example, Adobe Neutral is going to be a little flatter, a little less saturated. Adobe Landscape is going to lift your blacks a little more than Adobe Color, and it's going to saturate your photo just a bit more. And then there's Adobe Vivid, which is very contrasty, more saturated, but I just like to stick with Adobe Color, personally. So right after that, the great thing about Lightroom is that everything that you're using is for the most part in order. As you use it more, you'll see that you might want to use a different tool further down before you use a tool up above, but for this tutorial, I'm essentially just going to go in order. So next will be white balance. A great tool is this auto white balance if your camera didn't get it quite right. So you can see Adobe wants this photo to, or has interpreted it to be a little too tinted red, so it's tinted it a bit more green just visually. I'm going to go with as shot because I do trust my camera to get the white balance correct, and I can always go back and influence the white balance later. Alright, so next, and you'll have your sliders down here if you want to do custom, so if I want a really orange hue, or I want to tint it, there's always that. Alright, next is your exposure. So up here, where my cursor is the histogram. So it's going to show you kind of where your exposure lies within this photo. So right now it's saying a lot of my photo is in the shadows, deep midtones, that area. So I can boost my exposure and kind of bring out a little more of the shadow area over here. Because I increased my exposure, you're going to see the whites down here are overexposed, and that brings me to the next tool, which is contrast. And if you reduce that, it is going to bring your blacks up, so these dark areas. It's going to bring your shadows up, and then it's going to reduce your highlights, these brighter areas. So I'm actually going to leave contrast at 0 because below contrast is 4 sliders that are going to give you a manual adjustment of your contrast. So your highlights are going to apply to these really bright areas like these whites here. So you can see if I turn this down, which I will for this photo, you'll see I recover some of my whites, and you can also see in the histogram up here the highlights being brought down. And I just like to play with that level until it's somewhere that I like, so around there. Okay, shadows are going to be your darker areas, like in here, down below here. So if I bring those up, you'll see it's brightening up the shadow area. So I'll bring that all the way up for this photo because the contrast is so intense. This was shot in the narrows, so there's not much light that gets down between the walls. And then your whites are going to be white areas. Not specifically white, but it's almost like your highlights, but it's broader. It applies to more than just your highlights. So it's gonna mostly focus on your whites, but it's also gonna increase on the walls of the narrows where there's light hitting. And your blacks are mostly focusing on the deep, darkest shadows, your really black areas of your photo. So you'll see in here it's going to darken up a bit, but I think I'm actually going to raise my blacks for this photo, or maybe I'll just keep them at 0. I kind of like them at 0. So down here it says presence. I don't really know why it says that, but that doesn't matter. What is important is these tools, texture, clarity, and dehaze. Texture is a new tool added to Lightroom, so that's going to take kind of a patterned area like down here, and it's going to, like, taking those fine grains within the pixels and kind of increasing the contrast around them to give you that textured look. And then clarity is going to soften or kind of harden your image. So it'll reduce contrast or increase contrast around a broader area. So you can see how that's happening. I don't like to mess around with these tools too much because it's something I can always come back to, but once you do it, you are stuck with it. Once you import into Photoshop, it is pretty much impossible to undo these. Shadows, highlights, whites, exposure, you can, if you keep your photo in a raw file format, you will always be able to change those, but texture and clarity, they're hard to go back and fix. So then Dehaze. Dehaze is a really great tool. So that literally is doing what it's saying. It's getting rid of the haze on your photo. When I first started out editing, I was really addicted to this tool, I would say. And I like to use it a lot and really get a strong dehazed look. But as I learned more about editing, I actually realized that you can get a really nice glowing look by decreasing this, putting the dehaze in the negatives and adding a little bit of a haze or glow to your photo. Your next tool is vibrance. So this vibrance and saturation are similar, but the difference is vibrance is going to increase saturation in areas where there isn't already a lot of saturation. So you'll see these greens are already quite saturated, but this gray area is not as saturated. So as I increase my vibrance, you'll see this wall begins to turn this purplish dark brown. Whereas if I increase my saturation, we're going to get a similar effect, but these greens are much more saturated. So it's always a good mix. So I like to do a little more vibrance than saturation and just find a sweet spot. You don't want to oversaturate your photos, and you can always go back and adjust this later. The thing about photo editing is you're always going to want to go back and play around with your settings. So see, now that I've done all this, I can see that I want my blacks a little darker. Okay, down here, the tone curve is doing essentially what these tools up here are doing. As you can see, it says tone. So they're doing the same thing, it's just a different way of doing it. So right here I'm decreasing my shadows, down here I'm increasing or decreasing my blacks, up here I'm messing with the whites, and then way at the top is my highlights. And I am going to turn this off because I don't need it. Alright, perfect. Okay, this tool down here is super useful. This is going to stand for hue. HSL's hue, saturation, luminance. So you're going to have for each color range. So let's go to my yellows, which will include some of the greens, and then over here in these areas up on the wall. And you'll see the hue is gonna adjust the color between red, or more green. So look at the moss here. So this is very green. This is very red. So you can play with this. So I might want my moss a little more on the green side, and then I can adjust the saturation. So maybe the moss is too saturated, so I bring that down. And your luminance is going to bring that, how bright it is. So I can make my greens really bright, so I might want them a little brighter here. And you can do this for each color. So you can see the oranges are really affecting the walls. So I might want my walls a little more red tinted, a little more saturated, and a little brighter. And just do this with every color. Well, maybe not every color, but... And obviously some colors won't need it. You can see I'm messing with the blues here, which is fine. Alright, so that is all looking fine and dandy. Let's go down to split toning. So what split toning is it is your highlights and your shadows. So these bright areas, as I said, are your highlights, and you can change the color of them. So if I want my highlights to be really orange, I can bring this all the way up here, and it's going to make a really orange hue on my highlights. So, and then I can come down here and I'm just playing with the saturation bar. How saturated do I want this? Or my shadows, these darker areas in the photo, I might want to make these really blue. So I'll go here and you can see it's saturated the shadows, and I can adjust how much I want that to be saturated. But for the most part, I don't particularly touch those. Okay, detail. This is a tricky tool, sharpness. So this photo is not super sharp because my tripod legs were shaking in the water as I was taking a long exposure. But you can see sharpening does a great job if I turn it off. You can see that it's not super sharp. And if I turn it on, it's going to sharpen it right up. And radius is essentially how... Alright, so essentially, I don't really know what I'm talking about with sharpening, but as you increase your radius, it's going to become a much thicker grain of sharpening, and if you decrease it, it's going to become a very fine grain sharpening. But for this photo, I'm going to leave it at around 40. Detail is going to focus on very fine grain details in here. But to be honest, I like to leave sharpening at what Adobe recommends because I think it looks fine. If anything, I would decrease the amount of sharpening on my photo. I rarely would ever go above 40. There's not much use for it. Okay, your noise reduction. So if you have a noisy area like this, you'll see as I increase my noise reduction, that noise goes away, but it also sharpens your photo a lot. I like to stay away from this tool because I don't find it necessary if you expose your photos correctly. And then down here is color noise reduction. No need to touch that. That's just going to get rid of sensor grain. So we can just leave that alone. Alright, now your lens corrections. So this tool is super cool. Chromatic aberrations are, let's see if I can find some in this photo. I am sure they're there. Okay, yes, so all this green fringing around the rocks here, that is all chromatic aberration, and you'll see as I turn this on, that is all going to go away because it's sensing where the green is on the edges of your photo, and it's going to blend it with whatever color is next to it. So the rocks are, kind of a brown, so it's going to make it a little brown. And then if you enable profile corrections, that is going to, usually it'll detect what lens you have, but because I use an adapter, it doesn't know what lens I was using. So I'm going to click on Canon, and the 16-35 f2.8 is the lens I was using to shoot this. So it's going to correct for distortion and vignetting in the corners. So you see how it's corrected, the fisheye distortion. Transform, I'm not even going to go over because this is something that you can do in Photoshop, and I don't find it necessary to use at all. Kind of dishonest for landscape, to be honest, to completely transform your perspective, but to each their own. Okay, down here is effects. So this is post-crop vignetting. The name just means that if you go to the crop tool and you crop your photo like this, it's going to vignette around this radius. So it's after the crop, it's going to vignette. So there's that. Vignetting is just adding kind of like a black or white halo around your image. For this photo, I might vignette it a little bit, maybe around 10. Your midpoint is how far in the vignette is, so if I make it really bad and I move the midpoint in, this circle is going to close tighter, and if I open the midpoint, it's going to close less. And then the roundness is how circular or square your vignette is, so this is a very square vignette, this is a very circular vignette. And your feather is how soft this gradient is from black to a sharp line. So I usually like to feather a lot, and then my vignette amount just a little for this photo, and maybe move my midpoint in some more. So like that. You can, this tool right here, turn off effects, that's exactly what it does, it turns it off or on. And then calibration down here, I don't usually touch this, but you can if you have a camera that constantly is making your greens you know, a little too red, so you like your greens a little more green. So you come down here and you kind of mess with your hue tool. And it's doing essentially what the hue saturation luminance tool is doing, just in a different way. And your shadows can be tinted in either direction, and that's gonna adjust the hue of your shadows. But I like Canon's color, so I don't really touch that tool too much. Alright, so that covers everything for your basic tool set in Lightroom. So you come back up top. It's always important to keep adjusting your photo as you work on it. Okay, let's see how long we've been recording for. Holy moly, 16 minutes. Okay. So, let us move on to the more advanced tools. So, here is your... I'm not even going to go over this. This is not important. This is stuff you can do in Photoshop. This essentially is going to cover up an area like this with something nearby. So if you can see over here is my girlfriend standing in my photo. So I might want her gone because it's like this natural landscape. And you're going to hope it does a good job, but it usually doesn't. So I'd rather do it in Photoshop, which is what I normally do. So we're not going to mess with that tool. This is a red eye healing tool. You pretty much just click on the red eye, it will go away. And then here is the next big tool I want to talk about, and this is your gradient effect tool. So one of the things about the narrows, as I was saying, is not a lot of light reaches the bottom of it. And I want to show that in this photo. I want to display that. And the way that I might want to crop this is I like a 2:1 aspect ratio specifically for this shot, because I think it adds this very like wide perspective, and the top bottom length is not as important. So I like this crop for the narrows. So I'm going to go with this, and because I want to display that the narrows is kind of dark at the bottom, I'm going to grab my gradient effect tool, and you click and drag, and this first half area is where the effect is in full effect, and the second half is where the effect is fading. So it's full effect, and then it starts to feather out and fade. So I'm going to reset all of these settings. And obviously all these settings are the same settings you have on your basic editing toolkit. So to display that, I'm going to decrease my exposure, maybe drop my shadows a little bit to add kind of a dramatic effect, or maybe I'll drop my blacks and raise my shadows. Whatever looks good. I usually look here, I'm not looking at the numbers too much. And then do that, maybe -0.5, bring it up a little bit. Okay, so now you can see I'm getting this kind of dark, mysterious effect in the narrows. So without it and with it. Okay, the next tool is the Radial Effect tool. So if I drag this, you can see it makes a big circle. And the thing about the Radial Effect tool, as you can see, let me reset this all, is that it affects all the areas outside of the circle. So I like to affect the areas inside the circle. So to fix this, I press invert down here, and that's going to invert the area it affects. And because the narrows has a lot of light coming in from the top, I kind of want to display that by increasing the exposure at the top and kind of warm it up, get that golden light coming into the narrows down below, which I think looks super nice. And I'm going to actually widen the circle a bit, like that, and then bring the feather into full, like so. And now we're getting this nice golden glow coming down onto this dark blue water. So it's adding this kind of mysterious dreamscape effect to the photo. And then the last tool is the brush tool, and this is where you can get start to really pinpoint the areas you want to work on. So let me reset all this. And what I like to do is turn up or down my exposure a lot so I can see where I'm brushing. So maybe I want to make these whites kind of glow. So I'm going to start brushing around those. Like so. And down here you can adjust your size, so I can make it really big like this or smaller like this. And your feather is, again, how much that brush fades. So that's with feather, that's without feather. So for the brush tool, I like to keep the feather at 100. Flow, I wouldn't even touch. And density is not necessary to touch either, because you can always adjust. Density is just going to be opacity, like how opaque your effect is. So I don't usually touch that. So I've got my water selected here, the whites of the water. I'm actually going to brush this area a little bit. And then I'm going to turn my exposure back to 0 so I can actually start to mess with it. And essentially what I want to do here is I want to increase the glow of the water. And a great way to have glow in an image is to use your dehaze and clarity tool. So if I reduce my clarity, you're going to see the water glows a little more. You can get pretty dramatic when pinpointing the effect. And dehaze a little, and you're going to get this nice glow effect on the water. And I can also, if you click the brush and then click it again, you're going to start a new brush. So you're brushing a new area. So maybe I want to come up here and kind of get down in this, down in the canyon here at the top where the light's coming through. Put my exposure back to normal, and then decrease my clarity and my dehaze a little bit, like so. And then we're going to get, so if I get rid of it, there it is. And if I add it, there it is. So now we're getting this nice glowing effect in the water and the top of the canyon. And a lot of the glow effect and brushing actually comes in Photoshop. But that is it for my Lightroom tutorial. Hopefully it was not too long. But yeah, thank you for watching. Hopefully this helps. And there it is.